Hello, hello, everyone. I am Baruti Carl Alexander, and this is Minding Our Mental Wellness. I believe this is our 10th episode, and this is a super special episode, at least in my opinion. It's talking about generational trauma. And a lot of people talk about, hey, it's been in my family for centuries and for years and so forth. And they just say that's the way it is. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to discuss that and what is the real about that. So I would like to introduce my special guest, Ms. Natashia Miller. Please introduce yourself, Ms. Natashia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Natashia Miller. I am your freedom coach and trauma recovery strategist based out here in Northern California, San Francisco Bay Area. And I help individuals, families, faith-based communities, and businesses recover and thrive from trauma by providing trauma recovery services.
Yes, ma'am. And of course, we know our hosts, Miss Andrea Rojas, Miss Jennifer Kane, are professional counselors who help facilitate this show, Minding Our Mental Wellness. And this is a special episode. I want to ask this first question. Is generational trauma real? Miss Natasha, what do you think?
Absolutely. Well, I always begin with how we define things because it depends on that as opposed if we believe that generational trauma is real or if it is a thing. So first off, how we typically define trauma from my community is that trauma is anything that violates your internal sense of safety, security, and stability. It is anything that makes you feel internally unsafe, insecure, emotionally, mentally, spiritually unstable. So because of what trauma is and how it impacts our lives, especially when we're children, because we don't have the capacity to critically think, we don't have the capacity as children to process our natural human responses, our emotional responses to that which we may perceive to be traumatic. We don't have the language. We don't have the language to fully communicate those responses. And we lack the ability to see a traumatic experience from a multidimensional perspective. We can only see it from an ego perspective, how it impacted us. So if we really look at how many of us are still healing from some of our childhood traumas, we can go in to believe that generational trauma does exist because generational trauma is simply unhealed trauma that's in our bloodline. So that creates behavioral patterns and relational patterns within the family that's really based upon trauma responses of suppressed trauma, suppressed pain that we have yet to fully process and heal from. So some of us may be creating quote unquote generational trauma if we have yet to even revisit some of our childhood traumas to fully heal from those things which we didn't have the capacity to fully process as we were children. So I believe that generational trauma is a thing, it is real, and it is something that we can do the work and overcome and shift the trajectory of our family moving forward.
Yes, ma'am. Miss Andrea, same question. Is it real? And can you give some examples? One example, I mean, from our history here in America, of course, Black people have had slavery in our past. Even though it was 100 years ago, can it still impact a person today, even though it was that long ago? Miss Andrea.
Yes, absolutely. I think Natasha worded it really well, but generational trauma is the passing on of trauma from generation to generation. So yes, absolutely, the effects of slavery or war or racism can be felt generations down the line. It is something that happens to an individual, to a family, to a community, and it can be caused by many events, things that we are still seeing in our world, but anything from abuse, domestic violence, discrimination, natural disasters, war, slavery. There's a lot of, I guess, situations or scenarios where generational trauma can first be created in that a group of people, and then it gets passed down to their kids and their grandkids and so on. What we're talking about getting passed down are the effects of that generational trauma, and maybe we'll get into it a little bit more, but the mental health effects as well.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Jennifer, same question. Is it real? And can events that happened long time ago still have an impact on us today? And how I have heard about that a mother can sing to the child while they're in the womb, and that child can hear that song later, and it can have a soothing feeling or whatever feeling that the mother had, or excuse me, that the child had while they were in the womb, they can feel that. Is that true? And what are some examples of generational trauma? Is it real?
Oh, definitely. So, in regards to what you said in regards to slavery, right? The impact of slavery impacted our previous generations, which would then, in turn, impact how they parented us, their trauma responses in those instances, and then how we see the world based on what they taught us, because that's where we get our beliefs from, right? How we are raised and the examples that our parents and upbringing what that teaches us. And so because of that, and that trauma going all the way back to slavery, and then having family members that are connected enough to recall those things, it impacted how they see what you have to protect yourself from, because trauma regards our feeling of safety or actually being safe or unsafe. So if that is the case, and then Black people feel and continue to still feel, I think, unsafe in certain areas, then yes, it definitely impacts how we live now, how we see the world now, how we function in it, for sure. I don't know if I answered all your questions though. Did I?
Yeah,
Oh no, you said about the kid, the unborn child. That
yes,
part too.
yes.
So that's where the first instance that we learn safety. So if your mom is pregnant with you and she is experiencing a lot of trauma, then that's going to change the chemical makeup, her physical responses, her stress response, right? And then the child is using all of those chemicals to be built, born, created, right? And so all of those things will impact, how when the child is grown and born, that, their responses to certain stress responses, and they might usually have be difficult children that maybe need more care and comfort, because when they're born in that state, if they always experience that stress response, then from the mother, then now when they're out of that state and they're out of the mother's body, but they're still having the same cortisol hormone going through them, then it makes it difficult for the child to be able to understand how their needs are going to be met, how what is safe, what's not, and all those other things. And then it impacts them long term, and unless the parent is able to teach them that they are that safe space, and we do nurture and care for that child, to understand that, that parent will help support and give them those needs when those basic ones are needed in birth. So yeah.
I did some research on generational trauma. One thing they talked about was, they asked the question, was trauma through the genes? Their answer was no. And I'll go back and find that research article and share that also. But it says no, mental illness can be passed through generations, and trauma can be handed down through generations by how your family acts or is. but trauma does not necessarily come from genetics. What it does say, you have to be careful to separate it from environmental and cultural transmission, to just separate it from that and not just attribute all generational trauma to that particular thing. So that is one thing that they say. Miss Natasha, what are some examples that you have found or you have seen with generational trauma? I mentioned one. What are some others that you could think of?
Well, a lot of examples that I've seen, experienced, witnessed in the lives of others is the tricky thing about generational trauma is that a lot of times is subconscious. So a lot of times we're functioning in generational trauma patterns subconsciously. We really don't realize that it is a form of generational trauma because it's residing and it's coming from the place of our subconscious mind. And so that's why I always like to emphasize the importance of making a decision while we're adults to revisit some of our unprocessed childhood traumas, because that trains us to be able to explore the realm of our subconscious mind so that we can bring our subconscious mind, our conscious mind on one accord. For example, you know, I know for those of us that may be people of faith, a lot of times people don't realize that if they believe in God and they believe in the word and they're quoting scriptures, you know, and affirming themselves, that it's not taking precedent in them where they could fully see the manifestation of that belief system and really walk in it, because they have a different narrative that is contrary to that word coming from their subconscious. And the subconscious mind is more powerful than the conscious mind. So until we do the work to heal from some of our childhood traumas that's uprooting those subconscious narratives and really rewriting those narratives to where now they are our subconscious is in alignment with what we've trained our conscious mind to know, then we'll be able to begin to identify some of those narratives that doesn't even come from a childhood experience, that it really comes from that of generational trauma. So that's one of the takes on that. And a lot of ways to really help people with that process is first identifying the behavior. What is the behavioral pattern that I really want to change? And it's always been in my family. You know, this is how we always dealt with conflict, with passive aggressive tendencies. And I know this isn't healthy. How do I change that? And that's some of the processes of really going through that to really change the narrative of the subconscious mind and really get to the root of that behavior. Is it because of a childhood trauma experience that hasn't been healed, or is it generational? So I hope that
Yes,
answers the question.
yes, very much so, very much so. I know I have to fight against negative self-talk, negative, you know, I can't accomplish this, I can't do this. And really that goes against a lot of my dad's teaching, my teaching that he gave me, and to really, but the world a lot of times puts so many stipulations or negatives on what you can do and can't do, and you have to fight against that. But in my subconscious, and you mentioned subconscious, I have that model or that subconscious role model, that subconscious way that was put in there by my dad, that if I sit down and really think about it, really strategize and really work on it, I can accomplish most anything. But you have that battle between the conscious world and that subconscious, and it goes back and forth. Miss Andrea, you want to talk about how that subconscious and conscious mind work in kind of overcoming trauma?
I would say I see this in a little bit of a different light when we're talking
Okay.
about conscious and subconscious. Um, I do believe that there is definitely, when we're talking about the effects of generational trauma, there is a truth in investigating and being curious. First of all, even learning the word generational trauma. I don't think it's a super um, popular word, or maybe it hasn't hit TikTok just yet, but people are still coming to understand what this really means. So educating ourselves, really learning about what this means for ourselves and for our communities, and then being a little bit, a step forward, being a little bit curious, what are my personal situations or biases or scenarios in life that I see that maybe generational trauma has impacted myself or my family or my community, my world, because it's not necessarily a truth for everybody. I can say not everybody has experienced generational trauma, right? But unfortunately, there are a lot of us that have, a lot of people in this world that have and still don't understand or recognize the effects that the trauma has had on them and how it's been passed down. So I think being aware and acknowledging that is important first. I would say maybe that's like the bringing about of the subconscious, is like bringing that to light, bringing that up to the forefront where you can really think about it and process it how you need to. So I think I kind of think of it in that scope more than subconscious versus conscious mind.
Let me ask this. We are saying generational trauma, but isn't it equally the same that some people have a mindset of generational privilege? Isn't that true? Some people have a mindset of generational privilege. They've always had access, they've always been given a certain benefit of the doubt. So they feel that they have generational privilege. And that I think is equally appropriate to talk about generational privilege that they have in their mind. And when things don't go in that way, they think something was wrong. Miss Jennifer, what you think about that?
You saw my face?
Huh?
Nothing.
I did see your face. I did see your
Yeah,
face.
I know
Yes,
you
ma'am.
know me, and I
You gave
know
me
I
that
make a
look.
lot of faces. Primarily because I think we went a different direction. That's why I was like, where are we going with this? That's what the face meant. But
Okay.
realistically, the question was never answered in regards to what generational trauma and examples of it was. And I think we need to talk about that. So make sure we understand what we're really talking about today, right? So an
Okay.
example of generational trauma would be addiction in our family. Like you already said, slavery, racism, colonism, or things that war and conflict. Like I know a lot of my family members that are in my mom's generation. My uncles were Vietnam vets, so they were in the Vietnam War, and that changed their perception of substance use and how to effectively keep their family safe. Right, that is an example of what generational trauma is. So if we're talking about that, and you started out with it, then yes. But what you were saying, and can you repeat that for me one more time? Like privilege, you said? Generational
Well, just like
privilege?
a person has generational trauma, you mentioned addiction. I've heard of many situations, and I've seen it in my circle where when the mother was pregnant, she was addicted. And of course, there's a question as to whether that child will automatically feed into that mindset in that particular way. And I'll discuss that, but I mentioned about generational privilege also, which I think is equally there. It's not necessarily talked about because it's not a bad thing per se, but it still exists. And what I'm saying is somebody for instance, Vanderbilt or Rockefeller, that family member is expected to act in a certain way because that is their perception and the way that they live and the
Okay.
way that they were expected to behave. So that is equally true. But we did mention about the addiction that is generational, and can people overcome that? My research says that it is not in the genes, but it's in the mind. And how do you change that?
How do you change? Okay, could you clarify the question for me? I want to make sure I'm answering you in regards to it.
We're talking about generational trauma. How
Yeah.
does generational trauma is, we have said it's real. How do you break that cycle? And we gonna get into that, but, and you mentioned about addiction, and that was one of the ways we talked about slavery also. So those are very impactful things that can cross generations unless you change that cycle. And that is truly a way. And what we gonna talk about is, how do you change that?
So you're asking me what would be some steps kind of towards, we haven't got there yet, but just like how can we really, can we change it?
I believe we can.
I believe so too.
Yeah, especially because it's not my research said it's not a genetic thing. It's not a genetic thing. So it's a mental thing, but a mental thing is a hard thing. I give you an example. In my circle, there was a young man who everything was okay, but he saw a lot of things around him, and he suffered a break. He suffered a break of paranoid schizophrenia. Now, from my research, that was in him, but he had to have something that happened that caused a break. So it didn't have to happen, but it was something so traumatic that happened that it did cause that. And first of all, is that true? Let me make sure I'm saying that true. Is that part true?
Well, I'm getting the impression that, ladies, please let me know if you're getting the same thing that I think that Baruti may be communicating or trying to communicate. But I hear that you are relating generational trauma with mental illness. Like a lot of the examples that you gave, and those are, I mean, they can definitely impact mental illness, and trauma can, if not treated and addressed, can also, but they are not the same as far as the topic of what we're talking about today.
Okay.
So I wanted to make sure that I clarified that, because
let me say this. So I'm gonna try to give more of a understanding of what I'm talking about. My research says generational trauma occurs when years of unresolved mental issues are overlooked, creating an endless cycle of unhealthy cognitive behaviors and illness in one's family. So
that's the definition for sure, yes.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that is only what that means. It's okay, you learn to take care of yourself or not, or based on the experience of feeling unsafe in the world that you live in. Then you teach your child the things that actually kept you safe, and harmlessly sometimes, and other times it's just some of your mental unhealth that could be a part of it, which is that addiction or domestic violence and other things like that. And then that is carried down as an example that also then causes other trauma for your child, which then they have children and they can, if not addressed, then it continues with those same beliefs of what's safe and what's not, and how to communicate or not, and how to interact with other family members, and what's safe and what's not. And then that is passed down. Now, in regards to genetics, because that's a little bit of what I also hear you saying. In regards to genetics, yes, mental illness can be passed down genetically, but that is not necessarily the same as generational trauma.
Okay, okay. Um, I'm trying to understand that part a little bit more, how it's, I understand generational trauma doesn't necessarily mean it's dealing in any way with addiction. It can be something passed down, but it doesn't have to be. It could be, some type of habit.
It could be poverty. It could be, mental illness and seeing someone being in your family, being mentally ill, not treating it, and how their behaviors impact you and you being cared for as a child. That is what generational trauma is. And then that's where we develop beliefs, right? We believe that, like, I know I did this today. Okay. And I'm just going, my mom always told me today I realized it, that, like, as far as like the flu vaccine, she was like, well, that's just gonna give you the flu. So and you haven't had it before and you haven't had no problem, so you don't need it. Now, my doctor tells me, you have type 1 diabetes, you need to make sure you got all the things that protect your immune system, right? But because my mom always told me that, and I haven't gotten the flu where I'm ill, right? When the pharmacist asked me if I wanted the flu vaccine, I was just like, nah, I'm okay. I don't really need that. I don't, because that belief was passed down to me because she never did it, because she didn't believe that in it. All of those other things, and that how it impacts how I see the world and how I function in it. That's what I'm talking about in regards to generational trauma and beliefs in regards to those things. And that my mom probably believes that because that kept her safe in a time where things aren't like they are now, where medical advances weren't, where, those things that could have kept her safe. And that's why she taught me that. Is that completely correct and applicable to this current context and this current moment? To me, no. But I carry that because that's what she taught me. And then I have to take a moment in regards to how we care for or address generational trauma. That answers that question. I have to be open enough to be aware that, oh, wait, that's how I'm thinking, and that impacts what I do and my safety in this world, and make adjustments accordingly. Is that applicable to what I was taught? Yes. Is it applicable to the current context in this current moment? No. This current context tells me I need to take the flu vaccine if I don't want to get sick and have other issues with my health.
Let me ask this. I think it could be more clear what I was trying to get at. Mm-hmm. Is generational trauma is real, but is it mostly in the mind, or is it something actually that manifests itself in the body? What do you think, Natasha?
So what I was what I was hearing you say is because we can live our lives until we hit a particular traumatic experience that we never experienced before, that could be so overwhelming that it triggers a behavior that we never even engaged in before, but yet it is still a form of generational trauma. So it may trigger addictive behavior because we just don't know how to navigate this level of a traumatic experience. And so now I fall into the realm of something that I've seen happening in my bloodline that I've never even engaged in, because this is the only way I can see coping with the magnitude of this trauma. So that's what I was hearing you say, that it is possible that life can trigger generational patterns and behaviors that we were never engaged in before that particular life traumatic experience. And it could go both ways when it comes to addiction, because addiction isn't always something that's harmful. It's not always something like we're self-medicating with drugs that's actually harming ourselves. We could actually self-medicate with being addicted to going to work, addicted to going to school. I got to have 10, 15 degrees, addicted to going to the gym. I got to work out in the gym for 3 hours every day. So it's not always something that's detrimental. We can actually be doing something that's healthy for us, but it's like we're just doing that in an addictive way, and that's how we're coping with the trauma. So that's what it was that I was hearing you say, and it made me think about how one of the most important things to put in place when it comes to shifting the trajectory of generational trauma, when we do the work to heal from our own unresolved traumas, when we do the work to heal from generational trauma patterns, trauma responsive patterns, we also want to do the work to put in place proactive strategies that we teach the next generation so they have these self-care tools in place to where they're even being proactive before they even encounter a traumatic experience. So now they're not triggered by a traumatic experience that's so overwhelming to that degree that may trigger an unhealthy response, because they have some tools in response to help them navigate traumatic experiences as they occur in life. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I might not get yelled at so much by Jennifer later, and maybe it was a little bit more clear when you said it and so forth. But though it's very generational trauma, what I'm saying is it's not just so cut and dry that this happened, so this happens. Yeah, it's a complex thing. It's a complex thing, and it can go a lot of different ways. One question I want to ask though is the Bible, excuse me, not the Bible, but religious people say all the time, and they say it is a spiritual thing. The sins of the father will pass down to the child. We've all heard that, and so forth. And there are some examples. I know you've heard that, Natashia. And what if somebody talked to you about that? What would you necessarily tell them?
Expect for me. So one of the other definitions that I have for trauma is that it's a human condition. And so if we look at it from the religious perspective, faith-based people, Christian in particularly, because that's the one that I'm most familiar with, generational trauma extends all the way back to Adam, because it's the result of our sinful nature. Him and the woman disobeying God brought sin into the world, which is why God had to send Christ as the replacement to get us back into a reconciled relationship with him, where we're not just subjected to the bondage that sin has for us. So if we look at sin as it being spiritual, yes, sin is the spiritual component, and that makes trauma a human condition, because per the Bible, it says that we all been born into sin because of what happened with Adam and the woman. So we could really trace generational trauma back to that point from a spiritual perspective, from the Christian belief, because that's the one that I'm familiar with. There may be a different trace back for other religious faiths. So I hope that answers your question.
But also, according to my research, it's not necessarily genetic. That would kind of say that it's genetic and it follows that genetic line. Maybe not necessarily true, but it's a behavior that particular person carries on, maybe because they've seen somebody in their family do it, or it's a feeling that they have that is triggered, as you were saying. I'm getting in trouble again. I'm sorry, Jennifer. But what do you feel like that, Miss Andrea? What do you feel about that same term when somebody says the sins of the father carry down to the child?
I'm thinking of trauma in like a non-religious way, and trauma is a perceived threat, and that's why there's so many nuances as to what trauma really is because trauma is, you know, in the not in the eye of the beholder, but the definition of it lies in the person that it's happening to. So what's traumatic to you may not be traumatic to me. It's a perceived threat. It is feeling like your life is at threat. If I could give an example, maybe, for example, someone whose grandparents lived in Central America, right? A country with instability, economic instability, government instability, poverty, high crime rates, right? Their grandparents then come over to the United States, right? And then have kids, raise those kids. Well, those grandparents, having lived in worlds of violence and war and poverty, may have resorted to you know, having to deal with some PTSD, maybe some hypervigilance, and had to have had some harsh parenting in their kids. Maybe the cycle of poverty lived on when they raised those kids. Now those kids were exposed to, of course, their parents' aggression, maybe insecure attachment as a parent or a caregiver, as a father or mother. And then they have their own kids, right? Now we're talking about the next generation in the US. Well, those kids, their parents, their grandparents, right? What they were exposed to from their parents perhaps was also some level of domestic violence or abuse. Perhaps it was substance use, alcoholism. Perhaps it was, again, still poverty in that family that's running on and on. Now we're at the third generation, right? The grandkids. Those grandkids then, because of what they've been exposed to, they may not have PTSD. They may not have lived through the wars or the high crime or the violence from their parents' natal country. But they may still experience things like depression, like anxiety, like unhealthy relationship attachments, like difficulty trusting others, like substance use issues, right? That's the type of cycle that we're talking about that gets passed down from family to family, from generation to generation.
So what I'm hearing across all the things we've been talking about, cultural, environmental, has just as much to do as the factors of how your family acts or what they see. So environmental, where you live, and the social economic factors have just as much to do with it as any other thing. Am I going in the right direction, Miss Jennifer?
I think so. I definitely think so. But I guess where I was having difficulty staying and making sure that we were on the topic of generational trauma is that we were talking about things that weren't directly related to that, and I think that's what Andrea was communicating. Like we're referring to experiences and things that we are taught through our generations of our families that impact our functioning or lack thereof now, right? Not necessarily biological, genetic aspects of that, even though it is a part of it. That's not based in the actual definition of what generational trauma is, and that's what I think Andrea was redirecting us to, from my understanding. And that's what I think is important to acknowledge. Yes, it does impact us. If our parents have a set of beliefs they taught us, we experience traumatic things while, you know, watching our parents and their responses to certain experiences that they had that were traumatic, even, you know, their responses to those experiences when they grew up, and then they taught us that, even though it's not, again, applicable to the current context. That's what they believe, and they taught us, and then we respond by adapting that or doing the opposite route. But it impacts our entire functioning if we don't take the steps to identify what that looks like and address it. And I think that that's what's important. Like what you were saying, I want to ask you something real quick because I don't want to forget. You were talking about your dad and how I guess your confidence, or you were having some feelings about not being able to do certain things. What were the behaviors? What did he tell you? What were the things that he, you know, showed or believed that made you feel that way, and then carry that going forward?
Let me give the example. There came a time in my life where I was starting to hit a roadblock. You know, I was in school very smart, but didn't want to go to class. Well, that's my self-description, very smart. Didn't want to go to class because I wanted to get attention, and the smart guy wasn't getting the attention and so forth. So I was the last one that graduated from high school with a very bad GPA. But as I went on and started to grow up and wanted to now do more mature things, I had to try to find out, okay, what's going wrong that me seeking attention and so forth is not starting to get me the things that I want. So then I drew back upon the things that my dad taught me. He taught me, go to work every day, provide for yourself and your family. And those are the start that, and I had to learn how to do those things. And I drew back upon those examples that I saw. You know, I guess I started this about 25. I did go to school though. That was one thing he taught me also. And I finally graduated from college. It probably took a longer time than it would have, but all those things were in my subconscious that I saw him do and teach me. So when I hit this roadblock, I drew back upon all of those things to try to get to a place that, you know, he had kind of led me to. And it was not easy because I had all of these things that I had been through and was wanted to get all that attention, but I found out that was not the real thing, that was not something of substance. So that's the example that I was trying to share.
Oh, okay. Well, I want you to, like, what therapy can provide is you to get an understanding of what you were seeking attention for. What was it that you didn't get at home that made you feel that you needed to be seen in another way outside of that home? Because you did that when you were a child too, right? So it was something that maybe, it could have been dad was at work all the time and he wasn't present, right? And him not being present because he was working, trying to make sure that he was taking care of the family and doing all these other things, and you needed some attention from him, then that could be something that is defined as an example of generational trauma, because that's what we had to do to survive, especially in that time. And another thing would be like this generation, I would say Z's and Alphas. Generational trauma can also be outside of the home, meaning social media came up in the Z time, right? And they get all these messages from all these different people telling you how to respond and how to function in this world, what's normal and what's not. And then that is normalized to them, right? And especially if it's something that they can connect with. But even if it's completely opposite of what your parents illustrate to you, because you spend they spend a lot of time in those atmospheres of reading and listening and just a lot about opinions and things that could be the complete opposite of what you're taught or what you can perceive from what your parents are trying to teach you. So that generation has a different example of that generational trauma. Why?
I want to add this example in also, though. As a young man today, and I'm sure when I was a young man, there was so much peer pressure against what your dad and mom are trying to teach, and you want to be popular among your friends. You want to be popular among your friends. And I'm sure for the kids today, it's a lot worse. You mentioned social media, but I know you want friends, you want them to like you, and then when you get a little bit older, you want girls to like you, you want to be popular with the opposite sex, and all those things you're going through all of that, and then you may have a traumatic situation among that. For instance, you have a bully who might beat you up, and then that's a traumatic experience. That happens. I know I had some traumatic experiences, and all of those kinds of things can stay with you. And I think you mentioned, Andrea, that your childhood, those things can stay with you when something real deep happens, and that fear carries with you. That fear that you had, I don't want to get put in a situation where I'm feeling scared. I'm feeling weak. I'm feeling like, these people are going to put me down and show me up, and I'm scared. So those things stay with you, and you have to work to overcome those things. And it takes growing to a sense of maturity, and that happens for different times and different people, for different people, and that can be a generational trauma. Natasha, you understand what I'm trying to say with that?
Well, I'm hearing you talk about different traumas we may experience in our adolescence, like adolescence traumas, and how the aftermath of those traumas, and you mentioned fear, that is like the number one trauma aftermath, how it stays with us if it has such a deep impact, and that's something that we may potentially carry on to others. I'm also hearing about how sometimes, because I see trauma has more than just a mental impact, it impacts our emotions as well as our power to decide, like what influences us when we make decisions. And so sometimes it can have such an impact on us that we don't necessarily have the full language to fully identify and even articulate the impact of it. And so we're living with it, we're carrying it with us to where we're passing it on mentally, emotionally, and with our decisions and our behaviors moving forward. So that's what I heard you say. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you said, but that's how I heard it when you were speaking.
What I'm saying is, it's a complex thing, generational trauma, that can go into many different areas. I know as a young man, and many of our young men today, and they're not able to articulate it, or the possibility of articulating it is suppressed, because especially as a young man, you don't want to come out and say that you're afraid, that you are uncomfortable and so forth. You want to have that macho thing, and it can, I have seen it cause like a mental break, because you have this feeling that you want to express yourself, but you don't feel an opening or a comfort factor to be able to express yourself. And those two competing forces can cause a problem. And I think that problem can cause for you maybe a generational, if it continues, and it carries over to whether you have a family or not, it can cause a deep problem. Am I making sense with that, Miss Jennifer? What you think?
I get where you're going, just still not the generational trauma part. Unless the emotion, the reasons that he does not feel safe with communicating what he feels, right? If the reasons are because of the lack of support and acknowledgement of emotions and communication in the household, or the example that his dad gave, and he was a man of few words, and so you never knew what he felt, and you had to kind of guess to see. That is an example of what generational trauma is. Yes, if that's what you were meaning.
Yes, I'm just trying to share that you can have a situation like fear, and you don't feel a comfort to be able to work to overcome, or you have a safe space, and that can impact how you go about your life. And it can, I think, if you have a child and they are not able to have that safe space, that can impact them also. So that's what I'm trying to share. it's a deep feeling, and nothing's wrong with them. So it's not a genetic thing, but the mental or the psychological can carry over into a trauma and a generational trauma. That's what I'm kind of trying to get at. That psychological trauma can carry over because that individual does not feel, or they have an environment. For instance, if they have a dad and like in my household, nobody cursed in the house. Nobody cursed in the house. That was something we didn't do. So when I got to school or out in the environment with the boys, I would curse. I couldn't wait to go out there and curse, but I still have that, and I still don't curse in my house today unless my sister make me real, real, real mad, but still in the back of my mind, I'm saying to myself, we're not supposed to curse here and so forth. So it's totally outlandish for that to happen. So they know, hey, he's really upset then. So that's what I'm saying. And all those kind of factors can carry over to the person in their growth, and I believe it can, and it impacts the family, the generation, and how those people behave. We're going to get to real quick some of the ways that we can break a cycle of generational trauma. Would you start with that, Ms. Jennifer? What are some ways? I have some research also on it, if you would share.
Yes, sir. I think the start of it is acknowledging that it was a trauma. Because, some things, when we're taught certain things to believe, just like what you were talking about in regards to believing that cursing is wrong. And it says something about who you are and your character if you do, right? But then it was also something that you wanted to learn more about because you were a kid and you didn't understand why it was so wrong until you grew up. And you still, unless you get to a certain point, don't speak in that way, right? That is something that we were taught, not necessarily is a trauma, but it does help you determine what your beliefs and values are, right? As far as communication. And so, but in other areas, I know in a lot of Black families, I can't speak to I can a little bit because I do interact with my other clients, but a lot of our minority communities, I'll say, we have a lot of trauma that we sweep under the rug because it's going to make somebody else uncomfortable, or the family's going to think differently because this person did this to me. And so then it is not even identified as something that's traumatic, even though it is, just because that's what we're used to. And that's what's swept under the rug and never talked about. So that is a great way to start with acknowledging generational trauma and doing something about it. Now, of course, therapy is something that is helpful, right? To be able to manage it. So you can go through, you talk to an unbiased person, someone that's just not trying to throw their beliefs at you, but someone that can hear you and help you gather thoughts and understandings and even revisit, because a lot of the times we do block. Got to be real about that. I know I do. And there's certain things that I just don't remember because it was uncomfortable to remember. And then if I have, when I go to therapy or whatever else, I can have a conversation and understand what is driving my behavior, because that is what is going to allow you to be able to change what your world looks like and how you feel safe in it. And if you don't identify the problem, and I have this saying that I say to all my clients, you can't wake up someone pretending to be asleep. Why can't you wake them up? Because they pretending they're not asleep. And that speaks to the denial, right? You're not willing to acknowledge that it's a problem. So that's used a lot in addiction, substance abuse, that kind of thing. If you're not ready to address it and you don't recognize how it has impacted your life in a negative way, you're not going to change it. And if you're trying to make somebody believe, that's another thing. People tell me all the time, like they defend whoever abused them or hurt them in some type of way, to me, I don't know them people. I don't, and that's not my thing. I just want to know how it impacted you so you can function. But they are always trying to. I didn't have a bad childhood. Who are you trying to convince, me or you? Because I'm here to help support you with figuring out what is impacting your now, so that you can function and at your best and according to your values. I think we all were like taught like you can't go and say certain things to other people if that you do that, then you don't love your family or your parents, or and we don't feel safe sharing it. We can't do anything about it. We can't identify like certain, being around other people that may have different family dynamics can help you understand what is healthy and what's not. Being willing to learn from other cultures instead of keep causing a blind eye or just only believing in your own can help you understand, well, maybe I'm trying it. Because if we normalized it, if it's something that that's all we know, it's normal and healthy, and it's not usually. And so being willing to learn, being willing to be open and have conversations with people that are safe, because not everybody, open to that. But just being able to identify, yeah, this make me do this, and the outcomes of that, I don't want to do it anymore, or I feel these physical sensations and these emotions when this situation happens. Let me look back and think about what happened in the past that made me respond in that way, because we develop expectations about those things based on our experiences. So yeah, I think that is the best way to start. Acknowledging that it was a trauma, what it is, and that trauma can be, we already defined as something that makes you feel safe or unsafe based on your experience in the world.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, and one of the things they say is acknowledging things that happen, recognizing signs of generational trauma in yourself and your family, and understand its origins. That's what the research says. Communicate openly, build secure attachments, establish new patterns, and be mindful. Really think about what has happened and how you feel about it. What are some of the ways to break the cycles of generational trauma that you see, Andrea?
I think Jennifer put it pretty greatly. She worded it pretty perfectly, but I definitely like how you touched on the behaviors, because we've talked about behaviors throughout today, and Natasha mentioned it too. But replacing some of the harmful ways, some of the unhealthy ways that we cope with the effects of the trauma. That could be anything from substance use, drinking alcohol, to withdrawing, right, in our relationships, our friendships, our romantic relationships with our families, and finding healthier, better coping mechanisms or strategies. Like exercise, or finding a healthy community, a group of friends, or a group that you can go to. Sure, therapy, counseling is a wonderful way of doing that. Perhaps becoming in touch with your spiritual practices or your religious beliefs, whatever that may be, can also be very, very healing. Journaling, mindfulness practices can also talk about meditation, right? But journaling about your family patterns, right? These patterns and experiences that you've had, and the emotions that are tied to that. So yeah, I think those are a couple other suggestions perhaps.
Yes, ma'am. The most important thing I see is you have to be aware. You have to acknowledge it, as you say, and that's the first bridge, because there's a lot of people that won't even acknowledge or even question, even ask themselves why. Why is this happening? What are some of the ways that you see to break the cycle, Natasha?
Well, just going back to the definition I have for trauma, how is anything that violates your internal sense of safety, security, and stability. I think just bringing all of what Ms. Jennifer and Andrea have already shared on different ways to break the cycle and begin to practice being healed and whole from those traumas is really to do it with an intent of becoming a safe, secure, and stable space for ourselves. I think sometimes people are resistant with being vulnerable and transparent, even if they are in the safe space of someone else that they could confide in, because therapy is a safe space. They have to honor confidentiality. You don't have to worry about so-and-so that heard it through the grapevine. It's like, hey, you can let it all hang out. It's not going to go beyond those walls. But if a person doesn't know how to practice feeling safe with their own truth, they're not going to be able to open up and be vulnerable about their truth to someone else. So we really we want to be put all these tools together to really be proactive and really having a self-care plan in place on how we remain safe, secure, and stable in and within ourselves, so that we can become a safe space for others, and we can be comfortable in being vulnerable and transparent amid the safe space of others, where we can have these tough conversations and really gain a deeper level of healing from the generational trauma and just the traumas of life, period.
We are toward the end of our program. We have been talking about generational trauma. Ms. Natasha, would you like to give an overview of what you feel and what you have seen in discussions on generational trauma in your conversation?
Well, my overview is that we just had a great conversation. I like how our conversation really highlights the complexities of generational traumas and how it's really connected to so many other spheres of life that we can go into other directions. But Ms. Jennifer did well with keeping us grounded in the topic of today with generational trauma, because there's direct correlations with so many other components of life. It's hard not to highlight those things that really plays a part in it. So yeah, this was an awesome conversation and I love it. Thank you all for having me.
Yes, ma'am. What is your overview of the conversation on generational trauma, Miss Andrea? Is there some point that you would like to highlight before we go? Miss Andrea?
Looks like
Okay.
Sorry, it was frozen.
Okay.
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Is there a point of our conversation of generational trauma that you would like to highlight before we go, that you want the audience to hear before we go, that you could share?
Well, I do have a quote I want to share, but I think overall Natasha and Miss Jennifer have done a great job explaining some of these topics, or more in detail, the topic of generational trauma and how it still impacts us to this day. I think that there's still a lot of uncovering that we will make now and in the future when we talk about generational trauma. But when I was looking up quotes about generational trauma, I found this one about, and I think it's very impactful. It's about a tree. In the same way that a tree remembers the cut of an axe as it grows with a scar, future generations can carry the scars of generational trauma, even if they did not experience it firsthand.
Deep, deep. Yes, deep. So those scars that can happen 100 years ago to that generation family can still be felt. They can still have a factor in that person's life. Ms. Jennifer, what overview would you like to share?
So many things I would like to share, but it's not time to do that. But I do really appreciate the conversation so very much. I don't know why you keep saying I fuss at you, because I don't. But I'll make a face and you know what it means. There's a difference. Thank you for understanding and supporting me, Baruti, in that.
Yes, ma'am.
I really love the different perspectives, right, of this topic. And I just wanted to share my appreciation for you, Natasha, in regards to you sharing your perspective and experience and thoughts and beliefs in regards to it, because it helps us all understand holistically. So I'm glad you're here. In regards to the message that I want to give, I think it's going to be most important to recognize that when we heal our own trauma, we are healing our family line of trauma, right? If we heal our trauma. Now, I want to make sure I highlight that that doesn't mean you got to go and get everybody in your family before you that haven't healed theirs to do that. That's not your job to do. If you have to accept people for where they are, and then you make adjustments while you're on your healing journey. And I think that that is going to be most important. And I know, with me being a therapist in healing every day, I try to sometimes do that, like to help my mom and be educated about certain things or other family members. And it's hard because I want them to feel better, but I can't do it for them. And I can't convince them to change whatever that is that they have grown and done throughout their lives that got them here. So that I really, really want to encourage people to understand. So just the start of acknowledging the trauma and being willing to change something about what you are doing in regards to responding to those trauma responses will change a lot about your family's healing going forward.
Well, we have had a powerful conversation on generational trauma, and I hope our audience understands a little bit more. I just want to say my role is learning. I'm learning all the time about the different aspects of generational trauma. I'm learning from our professionals. And so if I mess up and say something wrong, don't hold it against me. I'm here to learn also and to just share with the audience. And we are going to continue our conversations on minding our mental wellness. And we're going to have one once a month on Sundays, and this is going to continue. And I'm going to talk with my professionals and my friends, and we're going to come up with our next title to help our audience. Maybe we have part 2 of generational trauma. We'll discuss it because it's a complex subject. And as Natasha said, it goes into a lot of different areas. It can go into addiction. It can go into many different areas that come across in people's family. And to be aware, to acknowledge those things helps us to grow. And even if your other family members do not want to discuss it, it's helpful for you. It's helpful for you. And there are many families that you couldn't even bring that up, and they're not going to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. And that's one of the things that is difficult, but it'd be helpful for you to understand some of the things that those people who you love are going through and what they're feeling, and then some of the reasons why they don't want to. It's an uncomfortable subject. Things can be uncomfortable, and they may never want to discuss it. But if you have these understandings and practices, maybe you can understand why they don't want to discuss it. I know with my sister, I would like to know why she doesn't want to discuss anything. I feel it's because, her way she's practiced for many years is what she's comfortable with. And she doesn't want to go to another area that's uncomfortable, where she doesn't have the same sense of power that she had in this paradigm. But I'm trying to learn all the time, and I would like to find a way for us to come to a greater understanding and have those different conversations. I would like to ask everybody, would you like to share with our audience how they can reach you if they want to argue with you, or let me say it, have a good conversation with you. If would you like to share with the audience how they can reach you, Miss Natasha?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm not going to argue with anyone, so I'm not the one to contact if you want to argue. But you can reach me. I'm on all social media platforms at Freedom Coach N Miller. And my website is www.c as in cat, the number 4, L as in love, global.com. And that's how you can reach me. Thank you again. This was a great conversation.
Thank you. Miss Andrea?
Yes. Hi, everyone. You can reach me through Psychology Today. My profile's under my name, Andrea Rojas, or through the Adorned Counseling website. I'm one of the therapists practicing there by Adorned Counseling by Jennifer Kane, of course. So adornedcounseling.com.
Yes, ma'am. Miss Jennifer, finish us out.
Andrea, I already said how you can get me. And
Okay.
Yeah, I am the owner of Adorn Counseling, and I just want to talk about what the name is, what it means. Adorn Counseling Made Beautiful, meaning, you know, those uncomfortable emotions and the things that we may be holding down inside. We can always have a safe space in therapy to do so, and specifically make it a beautiful experience about just releasing it, and that can happen at Adorn Counseling. Counseling Made Beautiful. Yeah, I really think it's important for us to just remember that healing aspect. If we want to break those curses, we have to start with ourselves first. And that means addressing it and being willing to change different coping mechanisms that we have, and being willing to learn, like you said, Baruti, because every experience I try to make sure that I learn from, because I ain't no way I'm gonna know it all. And if I expect myself to, then that's being unrealistic, because things change all the time around you, and we got to learn how to adapt. So learning and being willing to start with that, breaking those cycles and generational traumas, is by being willing to acknowledge that it even happened and to do the work to be able to address it, to move towards healing.
And one of the big things that in the area of wellness is to be able to have those conversations. And a lot of people don't want to have those. And that's why this is a powerful thing, to be able to have these conversations. And a little bit more gradually, I think the world is coming to be more accepting of the conversations and trying to break that stigma of, hey, there's something really wrong if you even bringing it up or talking about it. So it's gradually, little by little, we getting a little bit better at that across the board. Do y'all agree with that, first of all? Y'all agree that the world is a little bit better at accepting and having those conversations? Y'all agree with that? Well, we keep talking about it.
Maybe that's something that we can talk about next time.
That'll be next time.
All right. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. I'll put on the website and everything when our next meeting is, when I confer with our professionals. And we look forward to seeing you next time on Minding Our Mental Wellness. Thank you. We'll see you next time.